Well, good afternoon almost everybody. Terry Francis is going to be joining us as we sit down and have some time to discuss some aspects related to the work of an evangelist. Hopefully you're having a great day and your morning time has gone well. Today on Do the Work, we're going to be discussing a challenging question that in some ways is tied together with who is doing their very best to follow after Christ. And that is, how is it that we can trust God through some of the very difficult transitions that take place in life? And so we're going to try to break down some of the related matters that tie into it. Hey, Terry, you there? You got sound? I don't hear you. He's got to click some buttons. He's trying to figure out everything else that's going on there. Do you hear me? You don't hear me. That's not good. That could be a bad thing. Let me see if I can make a quick adjustment here. What about now? Oh, Terry vanished. I don't know where he went. We'll have to figure these things out. But we'll stay on. I'm sure I'm going to get him back in here in just a moment. Let me see if I can bring Terry back in again. We'll try a second round too, and maybe see if there's something strange going on. All right, there he is. I see you. Now I can't hear him. Are you doing something different this time, Terry? Oh, I kind of heard you there for a second. Are you using your phone? Unplug the cables. Maybe you can just go with the speakers. Well, he's kind of sideways on us while he's figuring out that stuff. Either way, I'll keep talking for a little bit as everyone's kind of settling in. We're going to look at it through the window of three aspects of our service to God. We're going to break it down and try to do our very best to connect it to some strong biblical teaching. And as we always do, give us some instruction idea forward and kind of see a few open doors. So to begin with, one of the things that Terry and I have been kind of laying out there and trying to, let me click one more thing here and see if we'll try it one more time. Is that the right person? Hopefully I clicked the right person. Let's see what I did there. I did. Terry's going to be using sign language today, I think, in order to discuss this with us because he's clicking all kinds of random buttons. By the way, Chris or Hal or someone who's watching, can you hear me at least? And maybe Terry will talk and we'll figure out, what's going on. He's typing me a message right now as well. Oh, there he is.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay, good. We're good to go. I don't know what was causing that.
All right. All right, so Terry, I've kind of laid out our topic. I've laid out the beginning of our approach, and so getting right to it. How do we trust God during difficult transitions? And the first thing we've got up to talk about is embracing our fear. So what do we mean by that? What are we trying to accomplish?
Well, let me say that we both just been through this recently. I think most people know that. My 1-year anniversary was Sunday, so transitions are interesting. The first thing I'll say is when you find out you are leaving, whether that is by your choice or somebody chose for you, that is extremely frightening. And there's a lot of fears there. We kind of wanted to use in our first couple of points here a story from Matthew chapter 14 of when Peter walked on the water. We normally describe that the other way. But it's interesting in that story that the disciples are in a boat in the middle of the night and the storms are battering the boat and they're all afraid and they see a ghost walking on the water. And certainly that heightened their fear. And as you and I discussed in our pre-video discussion, what's interesting about that is that that ghost turned out to be the very thing they needed, which was Jesus. And so often, some of the things that you realize when you decide, or it was decided for you, that you are going to move, that throws your entire family into a sea of fear, for lack of a better description. I know my family was extremely anxious. I know your family was anxious about the transition. We had both lived in the places we had been at for a extended period of time. I was there 11 years, and not only did we have the prospect of losing our church family, but also our community that we had grown very close to. And I know you had a similar situation. And I got to be honest with you, in my case, that this decision was not really something that I initially made. I was helped push that direction. Let's put it that way. One of the fears is maybe I just need to quit doing this. Maybe this just isn't for me. And I think my family might have been okay with that at one point, to stay and keep their community and their church family. And Dad just got out of preaching and go sell cars or real estate or something. There's a lot of fears there that you face, a lot of anxiety. Where am I going to go?
Yeah. I've got a lot of friends whose their jobs have that same mobility built into it. Like it's an expected thing where they may not be in the same place for more than 4 or 5 years. Guys in the military, guys on the upper edge of corporate structures, guys whose jobs and tasks tend to be more regional rather than city-based or community-based. And so as part of their life, they've kind of adopted to this, and their parents, their families, their kids, all that stuff struggles very much in the same way that Terry and I are talking about. I remember when I made the decision for our family and told the brethren where I was at, and it sticks in as a key date for me because it was September 25th on a Sunday. And then September 26th, which was my birthday, I spent basically the entire day in my office by myself. And no one was coming to me and saying much of anything. I was processing all of my stuff. And that was a pretty fearful time for me. Like, yeah, I kind of knew what the next couple of months would look like. And yeah, I kind of knew what the outcome would look like. But I sat around going, is this right? Did I make the right decision? Maybe I was short-sighted. Maybe I was arrogant. Maybe I was confused. Maybe this isn't for me. Maybe I don't need to continue in this work that I have spent and poured so much of myself into. And then I had to realize that those fears weren't really completely rational. They were impacted by some sorrows that I wasn't processing. There were some things about the work of an evangelist that I had kind of suppressed and balled up in a little ball and stuffed it down deep inside and just said, don't deal with that right now because you want to do this or that or the other. And just like it was, I think, in some ways for our illustration from Peter, and I was talking with my family about this recently, and I know I went through this. The day after that, there was a sense of freedom in that I could finally develop in areas that I was not allowing to develop with myself. And frankly, my preaching and teaching and evangelism is better September 27th forward than it was on September 25th. I don't know if I'm better, but my effectiveness is better. That was very challenging for me. And I accepted some realities about what I needed to do rather than what everybody else was telling me that I needed to do. And then I started to trust God more in his timing and his placement. And I think that's a big factor of going through those difficult things, is to embrace them and say, yeah, the ship's going to rock right now. And I'm going to be on the edge of it, holding on like it's a class 5 rapid and nobody's at the helm, and we're just going down. That's a moment of true trust at that point. And you see it in Peter. Peter sinks, and yet God reaches. I think that's Terry and I both acknowledge that this is one of our favorite visual sections of the Gospels. Peter's faith right there is so powerful.
Yeah, I remember very vividly. It was the middle of December on a Wednesday night, and after our meeting, which was a little bit longer than I think initially planned, I sat in my office at the building for probably close to 2 hours, just contemplating all of just a lot of things. Let me put it that way. And one of the things I didn't want to do is go home and tell my family we're moving. I can tell you that maybe not immediately, but a couple weeks later, it was funny that everybody started saying, "Wow, your preaching's better," and a part of that is just in complete honesty, when you're no longer afraid of what may be said to you or reaction to sermons, you become more passionate and more effective in your preaching sometimes. But the other side of that is, I think through my preaching and through some of the things that occurred even before we knew where we were going, that to use the illustration here, I know that the Lord lifted me up. There's a song that is a newer song, and not every church sings it, but it's called Oceans. And in that time, we had learned to sing that song where I was at, and it became a very meaningful song for me. And it starts off with, "You call me on the water, the great unknown where feet may fail, and there I find you in the mystery, in oceans deep my faith will stand." And eventually I realized that this was my kind of get out of the boat moment, that where I was at had been comfortable for me, and I would have stayed there a long time had I not been forced out of the boat. I will be honest about that. Much longer than the 11 years. And when I was kind of forced out of the boat, I felt like I was going to fail, and I did not, because the Lord did lift us up in that difficult time. And I will say this, my fears of moving and my fears of building a new community and building a new life somewhere else, they became exactly what I needed. Yeah. In my life. And I'll share a funny story. I don't know if I've done this on this page, but I think I maybe have. When I got married, there's two things my wife likes to tell people. The first of those was she didn't know I was going to be a preacher. We started dating, which we debate the honesty of that statement. But for the other one, I know is true, that when we got engaged and she knew I was going to be a preacher, we were going to get married, she made me promise her never to move her to a state that started with the letter A. And so we had always lived in Tennessee. We lived in Nashville. We lived in Memphis. There was an opportunity in Arkansas one time, and there was actually a discussion about Arkansas starts with the letter A. And at that time, there was a negotiation that Alaska got removed from that list, and there would be potential discussions for Arizona, but Arkansas and especially Alabama were never a consideration. We live in Chelsea, Alabama, which is just outside of Birmingham. And in that transition time, it became extremely clear that we were going to end up in the Birmingham area at one point. And we didn't know if it was going to be Chelsea, but Birmingham seemed like where we were headed. And you talk about some conversations of, wait a minute, I don't want to live in Birmingham. I don't want to live in Alabama. And I got to tell you, as a Tennessee fan, I really despise having an Alabama license plate. It's just something about that really frustrates me. But it has been exactly what we needed. And so again, I think it's interesting that our fears, even some of them that may seem trivial, that may seem silly, once we embrace those fears, and you find out that they're probably exactly what you need, and they help you break those comfort zones. So, that's what I found in that area for our family.
Yeah, I think to a certain degree, this crosses into our second point, which we're trying to tie together, is trusting God in the midst of those storms. It requires us to dive in. And that's what Peter had to do. In his choice to step out onto the water, he had to trust. When he heard whom he thought was not real, was a ghost, was the Lord's voice say, "Come." And he makes that stepping out. When we talk about how to trust, step out. And so on the first layer, on the family level, make the choice to embrace the change and step out with your family and say, okay, yeah, we're going to do this. If there's a new thing to go do, we're going to go do that new thing. If our Our kids want to try this new sport, this new activity, we're 100% in, we're all in. And there's a certain layer of learning that transition, because our memories of what the comfort of the past look like will always lie to us. You see it heavily in the story of Israel. Some of the things we forget about Israel that kind of are great tie-ins here, we forget that Israel had a certain level of familiarity with Egypt. They certainly would have had some things that they tied to with successes. They were the people that saved Egypt, like their family did that. Yeah, I know that on the other layer of it was the awful oppression and the cries of the oppressed and the pain and the difficulty. But listen to them speak when they raise up complaints to Moses and to God. Would it be better for us to have died, where we were? Not even to be here. We could have just died in Egypt and we'd be better than where we are now. I think emotionally we behave the same way. We highlight the things we think were awesome about the past. We forget all the reasons that made it difficult, and we cling to that. Every ounce of that we cling to is actually a little bit of our unwillingness to trust God in the midst of a difficult storm, because we're not really ready to admit that the storm is leading us to the place that we need to be.
Yeah, when Israel left Egypt, there's a loss of their community, and they were truly homeless. I think that's one of the things. And we think about those early Jewish peoples, Abraham's descendants, in those early years as being nomadic, and they were largely. But it's interesting to note that Israel had, for lack of a better term, they had developed a homeland within Egypt.
Yeah.
And now they're giving all that up for a place that they've been told is great, but that generation had not seen, and unfortunately would not see, the majority of them. And so in that sense, the familiarity and the known and the good positive memories of Egypt, as odd as that is, when they're complaining, they're not thinking about the straws and the bricks and all that kind of stuff. They're thinking about their homes and their neighbors and the food that they had and the things that they did have. It's if you're not careful, you'll do the same thing if you're in this period of transition. By the way, one of the things we've not talked about is, we're talking to preachers mainly. Everybody who gets in one of these transitions could find some hope here. I hope that in this, that if you're a member of a congregation and you've seen a preacher go through this transition, or you have friends who are preachers, that you'll have some appreciation for the fears that they have and the amount of faith it takes to move forward, and to step out of the boat and to go forward in that, because it is difficult. I'll add a little bit of wisdom. Now, this is sometimes as a preacher, you're not given the gracious kind of period to wait until you're ready or to take your time. Sometimes guys are forced into pretty rapid moves, which makes that difficult. If you're not in that situation, I will tell you one of the things I did is it was kind of forced. Our decision was made before the Christmas holidays. And so you have Christmas, you have New Year's, and then a week later you have my birthday for me. So one of the things that I did is I just told my family, we're not going to rush into this because we weren't going to move till May anyway, or to June actually. We wanted to take our time, and we took that first month to pray a lot and to do some faith building and to really try to focus on handling those fears before we jumped out of the boat into the wrong ocean, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And if you're in this situation, you may not have that time period. By the way, the other side of that was, quite honestly, no church was going to talk during the holidays. They had other things on their minds. So it was a good time period for me. But it was very faith building on me to take those couple of weeks to really deal with the fears and emotions, but also to reach out to God and through daily prayer and meditation, those are quite different. And again, I would listen to this song, Oceans, based off of the story of Peter, and talking there about how keeping your eyes above the waters and those kind of things, and where we'd be called, and that, it may be deeper than we think we can walk, but the Lord helps us. That was really faith building. By the time I moved forward in the transition, I really felt like God's providence was a huge part of that. And I'd really taken the time to build up my faith in that area. Now, were my kids along for that ride? Not as much as I would hope, right? But again, I would just say, make sure that your faith is firm before you can move forward in that area.
Right. And, if you're thinking, and this is for preachers who have children, if you're thinking your kids are just going to line up with all these choices, just look at how they respond when you ask them to clean their room. Even the most dutiful, diligent child at times struggles with that basic request of go clean your room. And the expectation and the timing of all of that. You're asking them to trust you, especially if they're younger children, like you're needing to trust the Father who is in heaven. And so they are going to look through you to see to the destination. And that's a real concept and a real principle in families that takes place all the time. And the process for it is going to be full of moments where it does not look like the land you're looking for is anywhere on the horizon. Like, this journey is a lot longer. There's going to be self-doubt and questions there. You're going to maybe have brethren on the outside who love you. Maybe go like, wait, why hasn't this worked out for you? Maybe you shouldn't be preaching, because you can't go find a place to go preach right away. Well, not every prophet is the right fit for the right neighborhood is a kind of way to think about it. And so there's a few more things that go in the process. And, like we talked about, and Hal brings up this point, sometimes these decisions aren't thrust upon us. We make the choice because it's actually better for the church that we're part of. Like if I stay here longer, I see some things developing that are not going to be healthy for all of us. And there's lots of complicated corners to the preacher congregational relationship, if you will. And you see Paul deal with that a lot in his writing. He loved all these different brethren in different ways, and they struggled and they fought and they complained, and he reconciled and they reconciled because they're humans, they're people. They're not just characters on a page. And so they don't have the writing of the Hallmarks, the Disneys, the Marvels, or whatever, to have this powerful, cathartic release. And everything's great. Oh, it's all wonderful.
Yeah.
So I think that trusting process is also one that gets developed. Success breeds additional successes, but it's not perfect. Moses at the end is the one that we forget about in some ways, who doesn't go in the promised land, even though he's the one who petitioned Israel, or for Israel, that God could continue to trust them. And no, these are the people you picked. Let's trust them. Let's trust them to be what you need them to be. And in the end, Moses doesn't enter in for many of the same reasons that Israel as a group struggled with, which tells us a lot about God and Moses in other ways too, about God's sovereign power and compassion, and Moses's complete being a human, in addition to the other aspects of his great character.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think just to stay on track with time, let's move on to our third point, which is the way we worded that was to find a Barnabas so you can be a Barnabas. We're all reminded of the story of Saul that becomes Paul, and how in that transition he's rejected. And had it not been for Barnabas, and I think this is twofold, Barnabas, who's in one sense telling the church, no, you need to accept Paul, but at the same time is encouraging Paul himself to continue on. And of course, Barnabas, we all know, means is a son of encouragement. And so you need to find that person. I know that for people who haven't figured this out, this kind of page, you and I have been friends for a long time. We had not communicated for a long time. We found ourselves in the same similar situation of you a little bit earlier than me. In fact, I think you and I started talking about your transition before mine even began. And yours was almost over when I was in the heat of mine, which was pretty interesting. But in those processes, in a way, we became a Barnabas to each other. We were encouraging each other to know this is going to be okay. You're going to find a place. You're going to, you will, and we helped each other. There were times when I was looking, because you had just been through that process. You gave me all your notes about some place. I went in pretty informed about that. It's not a huge secret. Where you're at, I had a strong connection to, and we had some conversations about that. And so in this transition, and it's not just one person, but find some people who can encourage you and help you through the process.
Yeah.
And that's vitally important, I think.
And I think this is true, and I 100% in agreement with Terry in regards to the shared relationship we built in our transition process. That was a surprising blessing. We had been joking with each other about all kinds of family, friend stuff in a very surface level through the years, mainly through social media. But then all of a sudden it was boom, new level, next level relationship building. If you're using your Chris Emerson level of speech, next level gratitude, level 2, level 3 gratitude.
We had discussed our two sons' fledgling music career for quite a while, which has fizzled out, thankfully.
Temporarily,
but,
who knows?
Yeah.
Their dime store records may eventually turn them into nickel records. But I want to add one other thing. And Terry, I know Terry is in the same boat here. One of the first levels of Barnabas we encountered were members of the congregations we moved to. People who we did not know, but because of their compassion, their character, their commitment to God, they saw us in ways that we didn't see ourselves. And so for me, that was a step. And then in the areas around us, we've each been able to interact with brethren in new and rewarding ways. And I've noticed, and Terry and I think, are probably on the same page here, in the process of us being open about our work in this area, gospel preachers were reaching out to us about all kinds of things, and Christians were reaching out to us about all kinds of things related to the work of evangelists. I've intentionally tried to be a Barnabas in those occasions, like chosen to encourage preachers who didn't have a connection, like some guys I've been talking to. There's no other gospel preacher that lives in their country. There's no other gospel preacher that lives in their county or in their edge of the state. And so they feel desperately alone. And there are some things they don't feel like they can talk about. And so they need someone to talk about. And so some of the consequence for me of learning, having been encouraged, where Terry's poking at me, well, now I'm extending grace and the relationship of grace to someone else who needs it, so that maybe down the road they'll be a Barnabas to a third party they never meet.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, before I found a Barnabas where I was going, I had a Barnabas where I was leaving. I mean, there were several people that were very encouraging. But I remember specifically after my children came with me, because the way that process works, for those who don't know, is I traveled. I think most preachers are like this point. We do most of the communication with the potential church. I'm very careful about introducing myself or my family to a new congregation until I have a really good feel for that. And so to protect my family, I don't just drag them off to like 4 churches and then us discuss which one we like better. Dad kind of takes care of that. But we finally introduced my family to the church and the church to my family, that especially one of my children who had a particularly difficult time with the idea of moving as she was entering high school. She quickly found people that she not only respected, but felt like, hey, this is going to be okay. This is going to be, and they were adults, and they were from positions of somewhat authority that she didn't find that where we were leaving. And that has been a tremendous help in our transition, because there were people that provided that. Yeah. And so it's not just a Barnabas to the guy that's moving there, the preacher, but his family. They need their own Barnabas in each of those different roles. And like you, we find ourselves constantly talking to guys in other places. Maybe they're close friends, maybe they're friends we don't know, but through this avenue, we've been able to kind of connect to them. It's important to try to be a Barnabas to them. And if you're a member at a place where the preacher's leaving, let me put it this way. You're probably tempted to be selfish in your approach to him, regardless of what the circumstances are in his leaving. And what I mean by that, you may be happy that he's leaving because you don't like him. You may be upset that he's leaving and try to talk him into staying and doing something else. Regardless of which end of that spectrum you're on, or somewhere in between, what is more important, I think, from a brotherhood kind of aspect is encourage them and try to tell them it's going to be okay and that you love them. And I think that's one of the things we all need to be in that sense.
Right. And look, you can go, especially in the early stages of whatever these transitions are. And let me add a couple layers of transition for you. We talk about physical moves. Some preachers are transitioning from active pulpit work to some level of stepping back and retirement. I won't give all the details, but I remember talking to a sister in Christ whose husband had preached for longer than I was living. And she came to me and said, I need you to talk to him. I'm like, okay, what's this about? Like, I had these big giant eyes. I need you to tell him that it's time for him to retire and it's okay. I'm like, well, haven't you told him? She's like, yes, but he doesn't listen to me and he'll listen to you. And I'm like, well, what in the world? But then I processed it for a while and I realized that he needed someone to come to him and just simply explain, it's going to be okay. That your new role of service may actually be more healthy than your current one if you're ready to make that transition, because he was still whip smart about the scriptures, but his preaching was not like it used to be. His body couldn't handle the physical stress of preaching, and that's something that we haven't really talked about, I think, specifically, but preaching does wear you out. It wears you out from the inside out rather from the outside in. And we had that conversation, and he opened up and just said, yeah, he kind of wanted to, but he didn't know how to. He didn't know how to stop preaching. Now he's serving as an elder and doing a great work for the congregation he was part of, and not preaching in a full capacity anymore. He preaches a little bit, obviously, still here and there. But that transition, I know, had to be hard for him, because it would be hard on his entire family and all the tenors and tidbits around it. And those transitions are things that everybody goes through, like we highlighted before. And in the preacher's context, often that transition can be really painful, or it can be amazing. It can be one where this is just the right time, right place. And the way that those things happen, getting to those great points is going to be easier if you actually just open up and say, hey, look, I know it's hard and I want you to stay, but maybe you need to go. Or, look, I know you want to stay, but maybe you need to go. Have that conversation with love rather than just, I'm done with you. I don't know what to say to you anymore. Because the emotions are so hard for me to process. And look, they're emotional. Generally speaking, in any transition like this, there are people that are excited about it and upset about it. And those people could be in your house. It could be the preacher's family. It could be members of the congregation. It could be neighbors. And I'll expand this one edge further. Having, connections in the community, they often serve as blessings on both ends, but sometimes they serve as curses too, where you're so tied to those connections that they make it so difficult to depart that you end up regretting your decision. There's a setting that I'm aware of where a guy moved from an area, and it was so heart-wrenching to his family that he regretted it every day he was at his new place. He had to move again to recognize to fix some of the heartbreak that was there. So guys, be aware of that too. Like in these transitions and you're looking through the process of it, be aware of what's going on. Don't just act like everything's great, perfect, wonderful, because sometimes it's not. That's part of this being a Barnabas. Barnabas exists because someone needs to be encouraged.
And I'll say this, and this is where we kind of open up a little bit, just so people know, just because a guy's been there, found a job, doesn't mean he doesn't still need a Barnabas. I mean, I will tell you that in some ways I am still wounded and injured from my transition, even though we really enjoy where we live. We love the congregation we're with, and that's not a slight to them, okay? And I know you have similar feelings. There's some things about that process that have injured me personally, maybe in ways that I'll never be the same. And that's just how life is. And And that shouldn't surprise us. We all need a Barnabas in our life. I mean, everybody needs to be encouraged. This is just a message for preachers, but as Christians, we should constantly be encouraging each other, and not just assuming that because they're attending and everything seems okay and their family seems happy that they don't struggle with anything. We all carry some baggage that will require us to have that encouragement for the rest of our life in those areas. So think about that in regards to everybody, and also be that kind of Barnabas to everybody that you can be.
Yeah, definitely. So that's, Terry and I talked beforehand. That was really our goal as the takeaway of the process, as you kind of finally first, in order to have the success in these transitions and embrace the things that you fear and trust God through that process, that he's going to continue to provide like he always has and always will. We want people to get to the point where the Barnabas that's needed locally is you. Like you get to be the encourager. But yeah, Barnabas had down times too. Yeah, he wasn't just constant living on the highs. You see him deal with struggles. That separation from Paul had to be a rough patch, and the reason why, and then the reconciliation between the very rough patch had to be a new high. That's kind of how all of us are through those structures and through those opportunities. And we've got a text here. It's not directly referenced so far. It's from Psalm 46. It's one of the great Psalms. Terry was listening to Psalms. I was reading Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. I was like, I need wisdom because I don't know what I'm doing. That was my response to it. And here in Psalm 46, it reminds us that God is our refuge and strength. That's something that is often viewed as a cliche. Oh, yeah, he is. Well, at different points in life, we're going to have to make a concerted choice. Do I believe that? Do I really believe that God is a safe place, safe space, that he's the cleft provider and his hand covers over that cleft that I hide in and I'm safe inside? This is not about foxhole faith. This is about practical realities in life where, sometimes it feels like that's all I got is him. And I need to use the strength that he provides to then lead my family through this next journey and carry it forward. So again, that takeaway, be a Barnabas. But sometimes to be a Barnabas, you're going to have to find one first. One last question is how Heaven says we are to cease striving often because the relief he offers is precisely the place we don't want to go to. And I think that's very true.
Like Alabama.
Like Alabama. I don't have that deep-seated allegiance to a particular alphabet soup of states. But we did have some connections. Like straight up, if you ask all three of my kids right now where do they want to live, their answer would be Columbia, Tennessee.
Sure.
There are families they love there, and those families love them. But there are some great evangelists doing good work in that community right now, and I hope that we're doing good work down where we're at. And in their arc of our lives, I think those kids and our kids will intertwine in a lot of ways. They will encounter themselves more often than not.
Yeah. In some regards, if you move there, that would mean one of those families may have to move away and they wouldn't be there anymore. So it's interesting. We kind of need to wrap it up. I will say, just to point out or remind everybody, this video this week, the topic was motivated by one of our viewers from last week. And so we say this every week, but if you have something you'd like for us to cover, let us know. Send us a message, and we'll certainly try to work that in.
Yeah, we do have some things coming up on the docket that we think will be challenging for us. A couple of things we talked about today I think are going to be pretty hard. And maybe some other things that will require us to be even more open and vulnerable about stuff. I personally feel like that's necessary for us as preachers, especially at this point in our life, helping younger preachers and encouraging them and connecting them with the resources that help them grow. And so one of the things I didn't mention this to you, Terry, I talked to Chris Emerson, that famous guy we know. He's going to come back on in the future, and we're going to talk about how are those frogs tasting. So Maybe
I'll try to get a bucket of fried frog legs for that episode and sit here and eat my frog.
Don't they have that in Alabama? They sell that in Alabama, don't they?
I'm sure they have it somewhere. I'll be able to find it for sure.
Yeah, definitely so. At least some boiled peanuts.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, everybody, take care. Leave us a message.
Yeah, have a good day.
Talk about. Have a great day.
Yep.